Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I only get one more class. I'm going to use every minute of it, Jeff. I'm not going to let them push me off. Squeeze every minute out of my last class. Nehemiah 13. And we'll complete our time in these days of the exiles in Nehemiah 13. Hope everyone has benefited from this study. It's probably a time period I had not spent as much time in as I should, and a lot of stuff going on. It's pretty interesting. Hope everybody found it that way. Before we begin tonight, would you bow with me and let's say a word of prayer as we begin our class. Father God, we thank you for the beautiful day that you gave us, and for the chance to be here tonight. We pray that the study of your word and the study of the lives of these exiles and their successes and their failures and their mistakes and their recoveries, pray that we can take all those lessons to heart, and that you would help us to learn and to benefit from that. Pray for all the classes in this building tonight. Pray that much good is done, and all things you are glorified. In Jesus' name, amen. So Nehemiah Chapter 13. Kind of wanted to end here rather than Malachi because I think it puts kind of a better bookend on our class. Malachi kind of is, I think there's reason to believe it fits into the same time period, but it's kind of floating out here in outer space somewhere. It's kind of hard to pin down. Nehemiah, we're dealing with the same characters here that we've dealt with, and the same people and the same issues, and so I think it kind of puts a little bit of a punctuation mark on the quarter, and we're going to deal tonight with some of the same issues that these people have been dealing with throughout our quarter, and so I hope we find that worthwhile. I'm going to jump right into the questions, and I think we'll have a lot of good discussion as we go through these. By the way, I don't know if anybody looks at Burton Kaufman. His commentary's online, available different places, normally really good. His comment on Nehemiah 13 is this is one of the saddest chapters in the Bible. So I think that's probably an interesting comment and thought to start, that the book of Nehemiah, in a lot of ways the Old Testament, it does not end on a upbeat. So that's his comment, one of the saddest chapters in the Bible. So let's dig in. Hopefully you've had a chance to look in and read some in Nehemiah 13. So one of the things that we learn, and the chronology of Nehemiah 13 is difficult, I think, primarily because of a difficult translation in the very first verse, and we'll talk about that. But we also know from verse 5, 6, 7 that Nehemiah returned to Susa. So a couple questions for question one. Do we know why he did that, and how long was he gone? Can we answer either one of those questions?
The first part.
Okay, Carol says the first part.
Chapter 2, verse 6.
Okay, chapter 2, verse 6. I had that note also. What does that verse say, in your own words, Miss Carol?
The king asked him, how long will you be gone, and when will you return? And Nehemiah goes on to say, it pleased the king when I told him the time.
So it seemed to be some kind of agreement all the way back in chapter 2 and verse 6 that the king asked, well, how long do you think this will take? And there seemed to be some kind of agreement. Is that the reason that Nehemiah returned at this time? It's hard to say. From chapter 13, we do learn how long Nehemiah has been in Jerusalem. And to kind of answer that question, you have to step back a little bit, all the way back to chapter 1 and chapter 2. When did Nehemiah first come to Jerusalem? 20th year of Artaxerxes. So you can find that in chapters 1 and 2. In the 20th year of Artaxerxes, he comes to Jerusalem. And then from chapter 13, when does he return to Susa? 32nd year, verse 6. So he's been in Jerusalem 12 years, if that math holds up, somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 years. So is it possible that all the way back in chapter 2 that Nehemiah told the king, I'm going to be gone about 12 years? That's possible. And so that's why he returned. There could be any number of reasons that the king asked for him to return. We're not told a lot of details. We're just told that he returned. I will say that if Nehemiah asked for 12 years to do a project that ended up taking 52 days, his timing was off a little bit. He probably could have stayed a little less. But it is possible that was an agreed upon time with the king. So it's not entirely clear why Nehemiah went back, but we know that one of the things we can be relatively sure of is he was in Jerusalem for 12 years. Of that 12 years, the actual building of the wall is a couple months, right? It's a relatively short amount of time. So there's many years after the completion of the wall that Nehemiah was in Jerusalem. And, as you can imagine, leading the people, instituting reforms, working with Ezra, all the things that Nehemiah would do. So there's a lot we don't know about the time that Nehemiah was in Jerusalem. But I think we can put together that he was there about 12 years. What is a little more difficult is how long was he back with the king in Susa before he returned in chapter 13? Did anybody do any research or find any answers to that question?
Just what the commentary said, and they didn't give a basis for it.
And what did they say?
12 years.
10 to 12 years? Wow, okay.
I don't know where they got it.
You can find a lot of answers to this question. The only thing that you can read in Scripture that we be sure of, and I'm in verse 6 of chapter 13, and I'm going to read the English Standard. I'm curious to see what your versions say in this verse. But in verse 6 it says, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king, and after some time I asked leave of the king. After some time. Does anybody's version render that phrase differently?
Certain days.
After certain days? Okay. Anything else? Earnestly requested to come back? Okay. If you look at I am by no means know any Hebrew whatsoever, but if you look at the actual translation of those words, where it says after certain days or after some time, the phrase that's used there is at the end of days. At the end of days, I returned to Jerusalem. And there are some commentators who can point to different places where that's used and say, well, that means at the end of that year. And so you'll read some commentaries that say Nehemiah was gone for about a year. You'll read other commentaries that say end of days means the end of the life of that king. And so maybe that's where they get the 10 to 12. I don't know that we know the answer. Nehemiah left. He returned perhaps to Susa. The question says Susa, perhaps to Babylon. It's a little unclear because he does reference the king of Babylon in verse 6. But he left to go visit the king, and then after some days, after some amount of time, he came back. That's what we know. And while he was gone, what happened?
High priest had made a pact with Tobiah and let him come into the temple.
And so I'm skipping ahead. We'll skip on to question 2. That might answer question 1. The wheels started falling off the wagon when Nehemiah was gone. I mean, things went from a spiritual perspective, went a little haywire. Things did not go well. So that was the answer to question 1 I should have had up there. If you skip on to question 2, what evil practices had arisen in Nehemiah's absence? So in whatever time Nehemiah's gone, whether it was a year or 10 years, he was gone for some period, but it seems like a whole bunch of bad stuff happened. I think I've got a list of 5 that I'll put on the board in just a minute. Dad has already noted one for us. You'll say it again, Dad?
Elisha,
Yes.
high priest,
Yes.
had made a room for Tobiah in the temple.
So this is one to kind of stop and think about for a minute.
An Ammonite.
Yes, he is an Ammonite. Have we met Tobiah before? For whatever reason, the Jews have got a Tobiah problem. If you go back to chapter 6, let's go back to chapter 6 for just a minute. Verses 17 and 18. And we could be going back, again, we could be going back 10 or 20 years at this point. But if you go to chapter 6 and verse 17, moreover, in those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him. remember also that all the way back in chapter 2, Tobiah is one who was opposed to the work. It was Sanballat and Tobiah. So we got this character Tobiah, and he is an enemy of Nehemiah, but the nobles, the priests and nobles of Judah seem to continue to have a relationship with this guy. And when Nehemiah leaves, apparently there is some sort of arrangement made in verse 5 of chapter 13. They make him an apartment in the temple. It's really strange. And
Room did they do?
which room?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. What was that room supposed to be for? I think we're told.
All that grain and incense and all the stuff for the sacrifices.
Yes.
Consumed in the upkeep of the Levites.
And the upkeep of the Levites, I think, specifically. And so it says, we had this room. It was made to put tithes in so we could support the Levites. That was what this room was for. But instead, we make this kind of apartment for this foreigner. I mean, there's all manner of issues with that. The first one, and the one that Nehemiah points out in the first few verses, it says in God's law that no foreigner is supposed to be in the temple. Not only do they let him in the temple, he lives there, or at least he's got a place there. And then secondly, what they should have been providing for the Levites out of that space, and because they weren't, what were the Levites doing? They had to go back to work. They go back to secular occupations. They had to go back to the farm. That's verses 10 and 11. And so this complete, I don't know, this kind of wild removal from God's law. So kind of begs the question, what is the attraction to this guy Tobiah? How does he have so much influence? Why, 20 years ago, he was trading letters with the nobles, and they had oaths to him, and now they've set him up shop in the temple. What is it with this guy Tobiah? We already talked in previous class about one of the possible answers. Anybody remember that one? Yeah, he's somebody that very good. Yeah, I'll make you draw the family tree here in a minute. He's married into some nobles. Now he's not the one that both Sanballat and Tobiah, they had married into some noble families. So there's some in-law relationship kind of issues, is one. So I read something interesting in preparation, trying to figure out, why this Tobiah character keeps coming up. And one of the things I read and that made a lot of sense, just again, some of this is speculation, but I think it's fair to think about and to share, is remember all of these years before Nehemiah came, that Jerusalem was just sitting out there with no wall, wide open and open to attack, because the people didn't have the energy to do God's work, to rebuild the temple or to rebuild the wall. And so how do you just imagine that you are a corrupt priest in this city without a wall? How do you think in your mind, if you're thinking in a worldly way, how are you going to protect yourself and protect your city? You make an alliance with some powerful people that live around you. And you say, hey, listen, we can do some favors for you. You make sure nobody attacks us from the north. Or, hey, and that's, that would have been Samaria, where Sanballat was from. Or you say, hey, Tobiah, we can do some stuff for you. You can do some stuff for us. Help keep us protected. We know that there are some armies that are around your area. You can help us if we ever have a problem. You can see anyway, I can just imagine a very earthly political maneuver that would tie these priests to Tobiah. Why did they have an oath to him? Why did they give him a space in the temple? This was political maneuvering from people who didn't trust in God to protect them anymore, and they went around and make political alliances. To me, that just makes a ton of sense. Helps me kind of understand why Sanballat and Tobiah had such influence even within the ranks in Jerusalem, and why it was such a threat to them to see that the walls go up and to see God's people begin to form their own community. Their influence was going to be diminished, right? Their power, the things that they had were being taken away. So there's just so much, I think, in those short couple of verses about the fact that he was given this space in the temple. That Nehemiah spent 12 years trying to reform this idea and build the walls and trust in God. And he's gone for a relatively short amount of time, and they've sold out again to try to make these political alliances. It seems to me like that makes sense. Let's see. So number one, and that was a lot to say about the first issue in chapter 13, is this Tobiah given an apartment in the temple. And by the way, I call it an apartment and not just like a storage room. I think he was more than just storing his stuff there. Anybody got any idea why I think that?
Because he threw all the stuff out.
Yeah,
Stuff out and put all the typing back in the room.
Yeah, verse 8, Nehemiah says he threw out household furniture. I don't take that to mean he was renting a storage shed. I mean, I kind of take that to mean he had a place he was living.
It was his vacation.
He had a little summer place in Jerusalem. Yes. Can you imagine? It hadn't been that long since Ezra was reading the Pentateuch at the square, and now they got a foreigner living in the temple. Can you imagine what Nehemiah, when he arrived and saw that happening? And we'll see in a moment, he didn't take it all that great. Okay, so number one, there's literally a foreigner living in the temple. Number two is related to that. The things that should have been stored in the temple, they weren't being, I don't know if they were ever being given, but they certainly weren't being stored. And as Ms. Carol already noted, because of that, who wasn't being provided for? The Levites. Yeah, so that's verse 5. There's no longer tithes in the storehouse, and then down in verse 10, so the Levites aren't being provided for, and they go back to their jobs, verses 10 and 11. There's a couple of other major evils that Nehemiah points out in chapter 13. So Sabbath issues. So Nehemiah 13, beginning in verse 15, begins kind of a little paragraph there on some of the Sabbath abuses. What are some of the things they were doing on the Sabbath? They were buying and selling. There's clearly a marketplace. People from Tyre were bringing stuff in, bringing in fish and goods, it says. They're working. Yeah, they're working the wine presses. They're doing a lot of transactions, heaping up grain. It's just another day. It's pretty clear. For much of Jerusalem, the Sabbath was just another day. The markets were open. The commerce was happening. The businesses, the enterprises, the winemaking, it was all just happening. I bet you it wasn't that way when Nehemiah was around. But Nehemiah hadn't been gone that long. He comes back. So there's foreigners in the temple. There's Levites in the field. And it's commerce on the Sabbath day. And you can see Nehemiah's blood pressure is going up. And then we get to the last one. There may be more, but I at least had one more. They're marrying foreign wives again. And then the kids can't even speak Hebrew. And that is when the top probably comes off of the blood pressure meter, and Nehemiah kind of snaps a little bit. So, help me through, like, what does it mean? What's the deeper meaning to the fact that the kids can't speak Hebrew?
They obviously aren't reading and studying their Bible.
That is the most obvious. Yeah, that's a great place to start. Clearly, they're not studying any of, the writings of the old law. Those are written in Hebrew, right? And was it? And again, as we talked about last class, this is not a xenophobic or a racist, like foreign wives, or that was wrong because they were foreign. were these Hebrew men marrying foreign wives and assimilating them to becoming Jews? It was just the opposite. Like they weren't speaking Hebrew in their own homes. These Jewish men weren't speaking Hebrew in their own homes. They were clearly being assimilated to something that was foreign to God in their own homes. Just again, can you imagine Nehemiah? Your life's work has been the rebuilding of this wall and the reformation of this people, and you leave to go visit the king who's been very good to you and very good to the nation, and you come back and you walk into this. Again, there's a foreigner in the temple. There's Levites in the field. It's commerce on the Sabbath day, and you got Jewish children who don't know Hebrew and don't speak the language of God's people in their own homes. Just a catastrophic kind of system failure. If there were more, point them out to me. Those are the four kind of major themes that I pointed out. Do you have, Ms. Carroll?
I would lead toward this being a longer time than the end of the year because
I hope this couldn't all happen in a year.
right,
Yeah,
right.
it's very discouraging.
This is very
Yeah.
low to just boom.
Yes.
After Nehemiah went out the gate, they went back to doing the same thing that
Yes.
they'd done.
So Carol makes the point that how long was Nehemiah gone in Babylon or in Susa or wherever he was? You would think that this level of corruption, this falling apart, would have taken more than a year. And so that might be an argument to say that Nehemiah was gone a little bit longer, perhaps, and then returned. But we know it couldn't have been that long because Eliashib was the high priest when he left and he's the high priest when he returned. It wasn't like he was gone for decades. But perhaps more than a year. Yes, Eliashib does have a grandson, so he is older at this point, for sure. One last point on this. We could do it here or we could do it with the next question, but I want to contrast two verses just because I think that they kind of highlight how corrupt that has gone, how far it's fallen from where Nehemiah started. The mindset that Nehemiah brought to Jerusalem in Nehemiah Chapter 2, verses 19 and 20. So this is the mindset that Nehemiah brought to Jerusalem. If you allow me to use that kind of phrase it that way. So verse 19 and 20, chapter 2, you can read with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant, and Geshem the Arab, when they heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and says, "What is this thing you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" And I replied to them, "The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will arise and build." And note this last statement. "But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem." So to those three foreigners, he's pretty blunt here. You have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. And you flip over to chapter 13. In verse 5, and Eliashib has prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering. Tobiah got in. Like Nehemiah said he didn't have a part or a lot in Jerusalem. You can forget Jerusalem. Tobiah got in the temple. He lived there. I just think those two verses are provide such a contrast for how far the people have fallen. So kind of leads us to this question. This is more thought conjecture than it is pointing to a verse specifically, but how is it possible that Israel has fallen so far so quickly?
Their high priest.
All right, so I think there's a laundry list of answers, but Carol provides one. She says the high priest. So what do you mean by that?
They're corrupt.
The priesthood, and certainly at least the high priest, is corrupt. So how does that lead to the failures that we've talked about?
Their leadership is gone, and they're allowing anything to try to, like you said, to try to be, so they don't get taxed or making taxes people amongst them.
The priesthood, and we talked about that when we talked about Malachi, right, for sure, and we also talked about it a little bit in earlier chapters of Nehemiah. There's some evidence that this complete corruption of the priesthood is already happening, and it's already happened, and we know that it'll continue to happen until it's really in Jesus' day. Yes, ma'am.
Well, when you think about the law itself, you have rules, you have vows, you have promises, covenants, and everything, but also they're ultimately powerless to stop sin. And that's when we move on to Jesus' law.
Yes.
But they have
That's a great point. Yeah, very well said. And furthermore, what laws and promises and covenants were out there, they aren't even being taught, because the role of teaching, the responsibility of teaching, fell on who? The priest.
So when the priests are buddying up with Tobiah, I mean,
Yeah.
and then he's following Tobiah's lead, obviously. Right? It's a trickle effect. It just works its way on down.
And so, this as you said, this rotting from the top, the priesthood being corrupted, and so the priesthood failing to teach the law and the covenants that Judy notes that are part of that law to the people. And so the people never get taught. And so as a result of that generation never being taught, there's another generation that comes along that knows even less. And then there's another generation that comes along that doesn't even care about Hebrew. You can see they're not even, they're speaking Arab in their homes and with foreign wives. And so you can kind of see that pattern. So one is the priesthood was corrupted. So we'll put that first. And I think anything else we say is somewhat a derivative of that the priesthood was corrupted. What else do you think it all?
They didn't keep themselves separated. I mean, what happened with Tobiah in the temple is just a picture of what happened in the society as a whole. So God brought them back here to set them apart as his people. He helped, he enabled them to have all the money that Ezra brought, the goods that Ezra brought. He enabled them to build the wall in 52 days, all for the purpose of setting them apart as his people. And, next thing you know, there's a foreigner living in the temple that had just let the world, they didn't keep themselves separated. God separated them. But they chose not to purify themselves, and they chose to let the world creep in. And then it's just like we said, they were relying on other people and themselves instead of God to get by.
So I'll summarize that in case you couldn't hear all of it, but excellent. That God intended to move this group of exiles, this remnant, back to Jerusalem so that they could be separate, they could be holy, they could be set apart. And the people were dead set against being separate and holy and set apart. They were determined to be infiltrated and integrated with the world around them. You see it time after time. And because of that, they didn't have the holiness, and they didn't have and by the way, I don't want to be too blunt an instrument here, but I mean, all of these things that we're talking about are very, very relevant. Like what happened to Jerusalem in a few years can happen to the church in a few years. There's a leadership vacuum, and we integrate all the world gets integrated into everything we do, for sure. All right, what else?
Nobody knows the law. I mean, they're not reading it, so they don't know it.
So lack of knowledge, yeah.
They don't know Deuteronomy 23, which says no Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly. They didn't know that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So that's a great point. Is like this pretty fundamental, like I think we would all kind of not be surprised that the law said that there wasn't supposed to be an Ammonite or a Moabite in the temple. Like we are non-Jews 2,500 years later, and we kind of get that there's no Ammonite. But when the people read it in verse 1, they found, at least that's my version, like this was a revelation that there wasn't supposed to be Ammonites and Moabites in the temple. And all of a sudden we got to do something about this. So there's a profound ignorance about God's law. So, no leadership, refusing to be separate, ignorance of the law. There's 3.
Michael, do you think Ezra has already passed away?
Yeah, where is Ezra at this point? That's very hard to say. Is it? There's a good chance, yeah, did he go somewhere else or has he passed away at this point? It's not clear. But if he has passed away or if he is gone, it may lead to another answer, and that is, remember, Nehemiah and Ezra, where are they? Like those who did have some, what's the right word? Some godly influence and some fortitude to do the right thing, they're no longer there. That's kind of sad that it only took the removal of a couple of people for the whole thing to fall apart, but it kind of feels like that's the way it is. And ultimately, you say all of that, and it goes back to what we said back in Haggai's day. These people just weren't particularly interested in doing God's stuff. Now, is that because they didn't have a knowledge of the law? And does that ultimately go back to the failures of the priesthood? None of these things are, all these things are interrelated. None of these things are independent of everything else. But all of those things, and you guys noted more than I have on the board, all of those things contributed to this, I don't think we can overstate, catastrophic failure. Not just in one place, but all over the place. And departure from being God's people.
The Israelites have been known though. Back in Moses' day, when they went up on the mountain, they got scared and they made a golden calf. It's just been a repeated history all from that point on.
Yes. Yeah, so, it's noted that this isn't the first time the Israelites have quickly turned away. Moses was gone for a few days on the mountain, they turned to a golden calf. Ezra and Nehemiah, I think, kind of encapsulate, they show that. They show this success and then failure. And Judy notes, I think correctly, and we'll get to this in the class, there's not a fix for sin. And that's what we got to get to. I think that's the whole point here. That's where we're headed. But clearly things were going sideways. And then just a brief conversation here about Nehemiah. What do we think about Nehemiah's actions here in verses 23 through 25? I don't think they should be emulated by elders like here. But in those days I saw Jews who had married the women of Ashdod and Ammon and Moab, and half the children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they couldn't speak the language of Judah, but the language of each people. And I confronted them and cursed them and beat them and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Just curious, what do we think about Nehemiah's actions here? I think that he lost it a little bit. Yeah. So
Come in and see all that, he was just probably infuriated and just lost.
Yeah, can you imagine? Can you just seeing all that stuff one after another? I don't think we should read into this that everything that Nehemiah did was great and that everything was justified, that this is, at least I don't. I'm happy to be wrong about that. But you can just imagine, again, what frustration level just had to increase every time he looked around and just saw another massive failure. What's that?
It just shows the humanity of a person.
Yes.
Especially one that's trying so hard to accomplish something.
Yes.
And it's like this a slap in the face, like.
That's very well said. Yeah, so
Moses dropping
that's like Moses, breaking the tablets. That's a good parallel. But I do think this shows a lot of Nehemiah's humanity, and I think that's a good word.
He was always very active in solving these problems. He went in and threw all of Tobiah's stuff out.
Yes.
He told them to close the gates, and he even stood there and watched the people from Tyre, and they came two Sabbaths
Yes.
in a row, and then he went out and confronted them.
Yes.
He was very active in solving the problem.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
For sure, to his credit. And all the way back.
Yes.
He was very active in solving the wall problem. Listen, Nehemiah was a great hero. This is not to denigrate him. I just think it does show his humanity. And after he'd fought through all these years of getting the wall built and the law read and the ceremony of the wall and the people signing a document that, listen, that wasn't too many chapters ago. We remember that, right? Back in chapter 10, that the priests and the leaders physically signed a document with a seal on it. We are going to keep God's law. We're not going to marry foreign wives. And he leaves for a few years and he comes back and it is just Vegas. Just wild. You can just imagine. I think he lost it a little bit.
That's the depressing
Absolutely. Go ahead. Which part?
Well, after everything he's done, and then to have that happen, it's like you're beat down. It's like, what else can I do?
I mean, you think about how much of his life he's poured into this place, the sanctity of the temple, the building of the wall, the holiness of Jerusalem. Like, this is his life's work. And he risked his life to do it. He went to the king. Remember, chapter 2, he went to the king and asked this ridiculous favor. And God's providence, he risked his life to get this done for this people. You could just see he just loses it a little. So, I don't think that it's not that Nehemiah isn't a hero. This is not that Nehemiah shouldn't be studied and emulated, and all but 2 verses of his book are examples of his sterling character. I do think he loses it a little here. And I think that that's a very human reaction to the things that he saw around him. So, not great, I would say, was my answer. It's not great. Like, this frustration just reached a boiling point for his reaction in that way. And I do think that is why, that's why this is one of the most depressing chapters. The way that we like to think about Ezra, or this period of Ezra and Nehemiah, is that the temple got rebuilt and that the walls got built, right? That's the story we tell our kids, is that it's about the exiles coming back and rebuilding the temple, and that got completed, and there was a celebration. And then Nehemiah came and we rebuilt the walls, and that was completed, and then there was a ceremony and there was a celebration. Unfortunately, in the adult class, we got to read the rest of the chapter. And then the people just fell apart. So that kind of leads to our last question of the quarter is, and whether we end here or whether we end in Malachi really doesn't matter. Whichever one you think is the last, chronologically is really the last chapter of Scripture, and I think in the Old Testament. And I think it could be either one. But Malachi ends on a pretty depressing note too, right? I mean, if you remember the theme of Malachi chapter 1, or the highlight of Malachi chapter 1, was, what did God suggest they do with their worship? Stop it. And then here, Nehemiah finds that the nation has just deteriorated spiritually to be no better than the nations around. And so, why does the Old Testament end this way?
I think this is when God decided that he needed to break you.
It was time, huh? It was time. And I'm going to go back to the comment that Judy made, is there's not a permanent sin solution. And that this cycle of successes and then dramatic failures, that there was not a solution of holiness. There wasn't a way. There wasn't a spirit to dwell in people. There wasn't a solution for sin. There wasn't a hope in a way that there is. And I just think that all of this points out that there needed to be a better way. That as perfect, and Paul makes this point, right, as perfect as the old law was, it wasn't the solution. Like, these people were a wreck. It wasn't the law's fault, but these people were a wreck.
Shows what happens when we try to save ourselves. Like, God's law was perfect, but without the sacrifice that he gave, there's no way to save ourselves by trying to keep the letter of the law.
Without the perfect sacrifice, without grace, I think this cycle was going to repeat. So the next question is, why doesn't God just, at this point, after everything he's done, you think about everything God's done for this specific group of people, Nehemiah, Ezra, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Zerubbabel, like this parade of righteous people trying to help this. Is this first or second? this parade of righteous people, why didn't God at this point just say, take them into captivity again, just wipe them out, we're done here, I'm good? Huh? Yeah, so I want to go all the way back to the first question of the quarter. If we go all the way back to lesson 1, question 1, the first question of the whole quarter we asked was, why are these books critical to the story of the Bible? And does anybody remember the answer or part of the answer to that question? In order for God to keep his promises, there had to be a Savior that came to Jerusalem, that had to walk, they had to walk on Mount Zion, that the law had to flow forth from Jerusalem, like all of those, remember all those answers. We'd read all those prophecies, that the Messiah was going to literally walk in Naphtali. He was going to walk in the tribe of Naphtali. The law was going to come forth from Mount Zion, that the physical dirt of Israel, that's where it was all going to start. And so, why doesn't God just wipe Israel off the map? He still has promises to keep. And I think that's the only explanation for why Israel's tolerated for another 400 or 500 years after Nehemiah 13, is God has promises to keep. It's interesting, he doesn't have anything else to say until we get to the vision of the angel that Zechariah sees in the temple in Luke chapter 1. But that's the only, how depressing. Again, we talk about how depressing it was for Nehemiah. Can you imagine how God feels? All of the emphasis that he put on this group of exiles, all the people that he sent them, all of the resources that he gave them through the king of Persia, all of the prophets, all of the law through Ezra. He gave all these people every opportunity, and they failed just wildly, miserably. Like, that is depressing. The Old Testament does not end on a particularly rosy note. So I think we kind of end where we started, all the way back in the first class, is God's still got to keep his promises. He gave this last burst of opportunity for the children of Israel. If you kind of look at it from like the big picture sense, he gave this last burst of opportunity for the children of Israel, sent them prophets, sent them back to Jerusalem, gave them the resources to build the wall and to build the temple, gave them every chance to be holy, and this was kind of their last chance. And I think in Nehemiah 13 we see where it ends. And if we didn't know what was coming, this would be thoroughly disgusting and depressing. But we know what's coming. And
Contrast between Elisha, the high priest, and Jesus Christ, our high priest.
yes, so the high priest Eliashib that we see, and then the high priest Jesus that comes for us, it's a pretty stark difference. So I think the Old Testament ends depressingly on purpose, because it was never going to work. And we needed a different answer. And that's the reason Jesus came on the scene.
The question of why does it wipe them out too makes me think about when he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham said, "If you can find 10." And even though, as depressing and discouraging as this is, there had to be faithful people left.
Sure.
Because we get to Matthew, and there's Mary and Joseph, and there's Zechariah and Luke, and there's Anna, who was waiting.
Mm-hmm.
And was it Simon
Mhm.
that had been promised he would see this? And so there were people who knew what they were looking for and had kept, maybe not kept the law like they should have, but knew enough of it to know and to recognize the Messiah when they saw him. And so just the thought that, as discouraging as this is, that God didn't forget the faithful ones is a little bit encouraging.
It's a good point. It's a good point. God did not forget the faithful ones, for sure. Any other thoughts to close the quarter with here?
I'd like to publicly thank you for teaching the class.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
It takes a great deal of courage to take 6 different books in the Old Testament and try to tie it all together and show God's purpose,
Well,
how the Jews suffered and how they come back, and
yeah.
how God's purpose is now met through Jesus Christ.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's been very, very edifying. It's I think there's a lot of lessons here that are pretty instructive, and how we can make sure we don't go down the same path. Thanks everybody for the recording.